The ballroom cost more to rent for one night than Sarah Monroe made in 3 years. She knew that. She had overheard the number once, casually tossed around by men who discussed millions the way she discussed grocery lists. And she had simply nodded to herself, picked up her mop, and kept moving. That was Sarah's gift, and her curse. 11 years inside this building. 11 years of arriving before the sun had any business being up. 11 years of knowing exactly which floor tile had a hairline crack near the east corridor, which executive stress ate chips at his desk on Thursdays, which bathroom on the 4th floor had heard more secrets than any confessional in this city. 11 years of being absolutely, completely, deliberately invisible. Tonight was supposed to be no different. Sterling Financial's grand 25th anniversary gala, the most powerful people in Chicago packed into one room, drinking things that cost more than car payments, laughing at jokes that weren't funny because the person telling them signed their checks. Sarah had one job: stay invisible. Clean what needed cleaning. Go home. But then, Julian Sterling's hand moved, and everyone in that room knew that glass did not slip. You don't look for an audience before an accident. You don't smile before the champagne hits the floor. That was not a slip. That was a statement. $400 worth of vintage bubbles spread slowly across the marble Sarah had polished herself that very morning. Julian looked down at her worn shoes, then up at the room. Then the smile arrived, slow and satisfied, the kind that needs witnesses to feel real. "You missed a spot, Auntie." The laughter came like a wave, and Sarah, 11 years of invisible, 11 years of swallowed words and quietly bent dignity, reached for her mop. Not because she was broken, because she understood something none of these people did. The battles worth winning never announce themselves loudly. They arrive quietly, like a man in a charcoal suit standing completely still at the entrance of the ballroom. Every other head in that room was tilted back in laughter. His was not. His eyes had found her the moment he walked through those doors, cutting through the crowd like he had been looking for her for a very long time. Nobody noticed him yet. They were too busy laughing. They had exactly 4 minutes left to enjoy it. If you have ever been the hardest working person in a room that refused to see you, this story was written for you. Subscribe before we go any further, because what happens next, I promise you, you are not ready for it. Now let me take you back to where this all truly began. Sarah Monroe arrived at Sterling Financial every morning at 5:47 a.m. Not 6, not 5:50, 5:47. 13 minutes before she was required to be there. 13 minutes that belonged entirely to her, before the building filled with people who looked through her like she was made of air. She loved those 13 minutes more than anything else about this job. In that silence, she knew every inch of this place the way a mother knows her child. The hairline crack in the east corridor tile. The third hallway light that flickered every morning and that maintenance had ignored for 2 solid years. The coffee ring that Mr. Patterson left on the conference table every single Monday without fail. She knew this building. She just wasn't allowed to act like it. The Silver Spoon trio arrived every morning like weather you couldn't avoid. Julian Sterling, heir to the firm, son of the man whose name was carved above the entrance. Marcus Webb, whose father sat on 3 corporate boards. Derek Cho, who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. Together they moved through the building like they owned the air inside it. Maybe they did. Julian had a game he liked to play with Sarah. He called her Auntie, always with that smile, always just loud enough for whoever was nearby to hear. Marcus once timed how long it took her to clean a mess he had deliberately made, and announced the result to the office like a sports score. Derek filmed it once, almost posted it, thought better of it at the last second. Almost. Sarah never reported them. People always assumed it was fear that kept her quiet. It wasn't fear. It was something far heavier than that. It was the knowledge, bone deep and earned the hard way, that the world does not protect women like her. It simply hands them a mop and looks away. So she mopped, and she stayed quiet. And every single dollar she didn't spend on herself went somewhere nobody in this building knew about. Not yet. That evening, as Sarah gathered her things to leave, she noticed Julian standing at her locker. He was holding a piece of paper, and the smile on his face was one she had never seen before. Cold and triumphant, like a man who had just found exactly the weapon he was looking for. 22 years ago, Sarah Monroe learned what it felt like to have the world remove something from your chest that you could never get back. Her son's name was Marcus, 7 years old. A fever that moved faster than anyone expected, and a hospital that moved slower than it should have. She held his hand through the night. She released it at dawn. And the woman who walked out of that hospital was simply not the same woman who had walked in. She stopped speaking for 11 days. On the 12th, she went back to work, because rent doesn't mourn with you. It was a Tuesday night in November, 3 blocks from the shelter where she volunteered, when she found the boy. Korean, maybe 15, curled against a dumpster in an alley off South Wabash, wearing a bruise across his left eye like someone's signature. Someone had written their cruelty directly onto his face. Sarah had learned not to get involved. Chicago had taught her that lesson more than once, but something about the angle of his shoulders, the particular way he was trying to make himself small enough to simply disappear, stopped her completely. It reached inside her chest and grabbed something she thought had died with Marcus. She sat down next to him on the cold ground. No questions, no performance. She just opened her lunch bag and held out half a peanut butter sandwich. He stared at it for a long time. Then he took it. His name was Jae-won. 8 months in America, running from something he wouldn't name. His English was broken, but his fear was fluent. Sarah took him home. For 2 years he slept on her couch, learned English at her kitchen table, and slowly, so slowly, uncoiled from the shape of a boy who had learned to expect pain. She never asked him to call her anything, but one morning she overheard him on the phone speaking Korean, and she heard one word clearly. Amma. Mother. She pressed her hand to her chest in that hallway and felt something she thought was gone forever quietly begin to breathe again. When Jae-won left at 17, GED in hand, a job offer waiting, and an envelope of her savings in his pocket, he held her hands and looked at her with eyes that were no longer afraid of anything. I will come back for you, he said. You owe me nothing, she told him. He just smiled and left. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that in exactly 6 days, the name Jae-won was going to mean something very different to the city of Chicago. And the people who had spent years humiliating her were about to find out exactly who she had been all along. The paper Julian was holding outside her locker was a bank statement. Not hers directly. Julian didn't have the patience for anything that complicated. He had a contact, someone who owed him a favor, someone who had quietly pulled threads until the right document appeared in the right inbox. It was illegal. Julian didn't particularly care. What the statement showed was a transfer. Monthly. Consistent. Significant. At least significant for a woman on a janitor's salary. Routed to an anonymous scholarship fund that had been quietly sending inner-city kids to college for 9 years. 9 years. Not one of those kids knew who was paying their tuition. Not one. Julian had gathered an audience before Sarah even reached the break room. He always needed an audience. He read the amounts out loud, slowly, letting each number land. Then he looked up at her with that smile and said she must be confused about how money works. Maybe she thought playing rich would make her feel like less of what she actually was. The room was uncomfortable. Nobody laughed as loudly as usual, but nobody defended her either. HR was exactly as useful as Sarah expected. Julian's last name was on the building. That conversation lasted 4 minutes and changed absolutely nothing. Sarah walked back to her cart, picked up her mop, and for the first time in 11 years, her hands were shaking. Not from humiliation, from something closer to a decision forming. That evening she opened her laptop and pulled up her resignation letter. She had written it 3 times over the years and never sent it. Her finger hovered over the button. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was older now, deeper, but she would have known it anywhere. Umma, I'm coming to Chicago. Stay right here, because everything is about to shift. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because what walks through that door next changes everything. Let's keep going. Nobody in that room knew the name Chaewon by accident. You learned it one of 2 ways. Either you did serious business with him, the kind of business that required absolute discretion and ironclad trust, or you made the mistake of crossing someone who did. Either way, once you heard the name, you never forgot it. The news broke across Chicago's business community on a quiet Wednesday morning. Chaewon, founder and chairman of JW Capital Group, the most powerful private investment firm in the Midwest, was coming to Sterling Financial. A potential partnership, a deal that could reshape the firm's entire future. The number being whispered was $2.3 billion. Julian Sterling became a different person within the hour. New suit ordered by noon, a personal chef brought in for the gala. The office transformed overnight into something resembling a stage set. Every detail curated, every staff member briefed, every surface polished to a mirror shine. By the people Julian would never personally thank for polishing it, Sarah heard the name Chaewon for the first time at 9:14 that morning. She was pushing her cart past the executive floor when it floated through an open boardroom door. Casual, excited, electric with money. She stopped, just for a second, just long enough for something to move across her face that nobody around her would have understood, even if they had been watching, which they weren't. That evening, Sarah went home and ironed her uniform with a care she hadn't given it in years. Every crease, every button. She hung it on the door and stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, the smallest possible smile. The morning of the gala, a black-suited courier arrived at Sterling Financial and delivered a single white envelope. Not to Julian Sterling, not to the CEO, to Sarah Monroe. Housekeeping. And whatever was written inside it made her close her eyes and press it against her chest like something sacred. Sarah's assignment for the evening of the gala was not an accident. Coat check, floor duty, the 2 most invisible roles in a room full of invisible roles. Julian had made sure of it personally. If tonight was going to be his greatest performance, he needed the right props in the right places. The Silver Spoon trio arrived early and found their energy immediately. There is something about an audience that changes people, not reveals them, changes them. Julian was already cruel in private, but in front of Chicago's elite, in front of cameras and money and the particular electricity of a room where everything feels possible, he became something else entirely. It started small. A napkin dropped directly at Sarah's feet with a look that dared her to say something. A comment about the floor not looking clean enough, loud enough to carry. Marcus timing her again with his phone out, laughing with Derek about efficiency. The room noticed. Most looked away. A few smiled. Then Julian picked up his champagne glass, and Sarah saw it happening before it happened. She saw him glance at the crowd first. She saw the calculation move behind his eyes. She saw the decision get made. The glass tipped. $400 of vintage champagne hit the marble floor she had polished that morning and spread toward her worn shoes. Julian looked down, then up at the room. Then the smile arrived. "You missed a spot, Auntie." The laughter came like a wave, and Sarah stood inside it like a woman who had been standing inside storms her entire life. She did not cry, she did not flinch. She reached for her mop with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Through the tall glass doors at the far end of the ballroom, she could see headlights. Black SUVs. 4 of them. Pulling up in perfect formation. Then the doors opened. The string quartet faltered mid-note. Every head in the room turned. And the man who walked in looked at no one, scanned nothing, until his eyes crossed the entire length of that ballroom and found the woman holding the mop. And then he stopped, like the ground had shifted beneath him, like he had been moving toward this moment for 20 years. The room felt it before it understood it, that particular silence that falls when something is happening that nobody has a script for. When the most powerful man in the building walks past the outstretched hand of the CEO without taking it, without even looking at it, and the CEO's hand just hangs there in the air. That silence. Chae-won walked across that ballroom like a man with a single purpose. $2.3 billion in a charcoal suit moving in the wrong direction, and nobody could say a word about it. Julian stepped forward. Some instinct, some last desperate scramble of damage control pushed him into the path. Chae-won's 2 guards moved faster, not aggressively, just there. Suddenly, immovably, there. And Julian stopped. Chae-won kept walking. He crossed the wide marble floor. The crowd parted without being asked, and he stopped in front of Sarah Monroe, janitor, invisible woman, ghost of 11 years. And for a moment he simply looked at her. Really looked at her, the way you look at something you were afraid you might never see again. Sarah looked up at him, and the recognition that moved across her face was not surprise. It was something older than surprise. Something that had been waiting quietly in a corner of her chest for a very long time. Chae-won bowed. Deep. Deliberate. A full 90-degree bow, in front of every camera, every senator, every CEO, every person who had laughed 4 minutes ago. I told you I would come back, Amma. Sarah's mop hit the floor. Every phone in that room was already recording. Nobody remembered deciding to take it out. It just happened, the way your hands move before your mind catches up. Chae-won straightened, turned slowly to face the room. And when he spoke, his voice was completely, terrifyingly calm. This woman raised me when the world left me to die in an alley. She gave me food when she had none to spare. She gave me a home when she could barely afford the rent. Everything I built, every dollar in this room tonight, traces back to a peanut butter sandwich in an alley off South Wabash. He paused. Let that land. Let every person in that room do the math on what they had just witnessed 20 minutes ago. Choose your next words carefully. Julian opened his mouth, and what came out of it was the single most expensive sentence he would ever speak. Julian Sterling had been handed every advantage a person could be handed. The right name, the right schools, the right rooms. A father who opened doors before Julian even knew doors existed. And in all of that, in all that accumulated privilege and comfort, nobody had ever once thought to teach him when to stop. That was the gap. And tonight it swallowed him whole. She's the help, Julian said. I don't know what kind of stunt this is, but this woman is a janitor. She cleans floors. Whatever story you've... Chae-won didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply waited for Julian to finish in the way that a deep body of water waits, patient, bottomless, completely unmoved by what falls into it. Then he told the room Sarah's story. Not quickly, not as a summary. He told it the way a man tells a story he has carried for 20 years and finally has permission to put down. The alley, the November cold, the bruise on his face, the sandwich, the couch, the kitchen table where he learned English word by word with a woman who worked 2 jobs and still found the patience to sit with him every evening. He told them about the morning he heard himself say Umma on the phone and realized he meant it completely. Then he looked directly at Julian. You poured champagne on my mother's shoes. The room was absolutely silent. Chae-won nodded once to the man on his left. His lead attorney stepped forward carrying a leather portfolio that had clearly been prepared well in advance of this evening. The withdrawal papers for every investment JW Capital held with Sterling Financial were already signed. Marcus Webb went pale. Derek Cho found something extremely interesting to look at on the floor. The trio, that invincible, untouchable, laughing machine, was quietly, rapidly, coming apart at the seams. Julian laughed. It came out wrong, too high, too fast. One investor, he said. My father built this firm from nothing. We survived worse than... Chae-won reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. One investor, he repeated quietly, and smiled for the first time all evening. Let me make some calls. It took 19 minutes, that was all. 19 minutes for the architecture of Julian Sterling's entire future to crack, splinter, and begin its collapse. Later, much later, people who were in that room would struggle to describe what it felt like to watch. The closest most of them got was this. It felt like watching a building fall in slow motion, knowing there was nothing to do but witness it. The first call Jae-won made lasted 40 seconds. 3 minutes later, Hargrove Capital pulled out. Then Meridian Group. Then the Seoul-based consortium that had taken the Sterling partnership 2 years to secure. 60% of projected capital. Gone before the string quartet played another song. Julian's father arrived at 22 minutes past 9. Someone had called him. He came through the same doors his son had used to humiliate Janitor 3 hours earlier, and he stood at the entrance and looked at the room and understood immediately that something irreversible had happened. The board made their decision before midnight. Julian would have no operational role, effective immediately. The vote was not close. Marcus Webb gave a statement to 2 board members distancing himself from Julian's behavior before Julian had even left the building. Derek Cho had already deleted the videos from his phone, all of them, the ones he had almost posted, the ones he thought nobody knew about. He was wrong about that. HR had known for 8 months. HR, it turned out, had time for a great many things now that the name above the door carried a little less weight. Sarah watched all of it from a chair that someone, she never found out who, had quietly placed for her in the center of the room. A glass of water on the table beside her, her mop leaning against the wall behind her like something that had already served its purpose. She was not celebrating. She was simply sitting, breathing, existing in a room that could finally see her. Chae-won sat beside her near the end of the evening when the room had thinned and the noise had quieted to something almost peaceful. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat the way they used to sit together in her kitchen at night, comfortable in the silence the way only people who truly know each other can be. Then he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table in front of her. A key. I need you to come somewhere with me, he said quietly. There's something I should have shown you a long time ago. Sarah looked at the key, then at him, and something in his expression told her that whatever came next, whatever door that key opened, her life was never going to look the same again. The building was on the south side, not far from the shelter where she used to volunteer, not far from the alley off South Wabash, not far from the life she had been quietly, invisibly, determinedly building for 20 years with nothing but her own 2 hands and a heart that refused, despite everything, to close itself off from the world. It was 3 stories, brick, fully renovated, warm light spilling from every window into the November dark. And above the entrance, carved in letters that caught the light, the Marcus Monroe Center for Youth. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Chae-won stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. He had started planning it 4 years ago. Built it quietly, the way she had taught him, not for recognition, not for applause, but because the work itself was the point. He had named it after her son, the boy she lost. The loss that had sent her to that shelter, to that alley, to him. Inside, waiting in the warm light, were faces she recognized, her scholarship kids. Grown now, some of them lawyers, one a teacher, one a doctor who had driven 6 hours from Detroit to be here tonight. They had not known who funded their education until 3 days ago, when Chaewon's people found them and told them the truth. They had all come anyway, every single one. Sarah walked through that door and into the lives she had changed without ever asking for credit. And the sound that came out of her was not quite crying and not quite laughing. It was something in between that has no proper name, the sound a person makes when they finally understand that nothing they ever did was wasted. She was not just a janitor. She had never been just a janitor. She had been building an empire the whole time. Just not the kind with glass towers and investment portfolios. The kind that lives in people. The kind that multiplies quietly in the dark and then one day, one ordinary extraordinary day, steps into the light and shows you exactly what it has become. Chaewon stood in the doorway watching her move through the room. This woman in her worn uniform surrounded by the lives she had saved. And he thought about an alley and cold air and half a peanut butter sandwich. And how the whole world had turned on that one moment of ordinary kindness. They saw a janitor. They were looking at a queen. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever poured into other people's lives when yours felt completely empty, this comment section belongs to you. Tell me your story. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it with them right now. They will thank you for it, and I will see you in the next one.